The strange thing about absence is that it doesn't announce its power when it arrives. It feels quiet, ordinary, almost invisible. People imagine change happens during dramatic confrontations, emotional speeches, or explosive endings. Yet some of the deepest transformations begin in complete silence. A message that never comes. A chair that stays empty. A familiar voice that suddenly belongs only to memory. At first, people assume they'll adapt in a matter of days. The human mind is incredibly confident about predicting its future emotions, and it's usually wrong. Psychologists call this affective forecasting, the tendency to underestimate how much certain experiences will reshape us over time. When someone has been woven into the rhythm of your daily life, your brain doesn't simply store memories of them. It builds expectations around them. It expects their presence. It expects their reactions. It expects the small rituals that happen without conscious thought. Then one day, those expectations collide with reality. Nothing happens. No reply. No appearance. No familiar pattern. The brain hates unfinished patterns. It searches for explanations because uncertainty consumes more mental energy than certainty. That's why people often replay conversations hundreds of times, examining tiny details that never seemed important before. What did I miss? What should I have said? When did everything begin to change? These questions aren't signs of weakness. They're evidence of a mind trying to rebuild its map after a landmark disappeared. Here's the part almost nobody sees coming. The longer the silence lasts, the less it becomes about the missing person, and the more it becomes about the person who remains. Every routine begins to expose itself. Every habit becomes visible. Every emotional shortcut suddenly has nowhere to hide. It's similar to walking into a room after someone removes the background music. You didn't even realize it was playing until the silence arrived. Absence functions the same way. It amplifies everything that was previously ignored. Someone who always depended on another person's cry suddenly has to manufacture motivation alone. Someone who relied on constant reassurance discovers how anxious their own thoughts become, without external validation. Someone who took loyalty for granted begins to understand its value only after it's no longer available. This is why absence often teaches lessons that presence never could. Presence creates comfort. Comfort creates familiarity. Familiarity creates blindness. When something exists every day, the brain gradually spends less attention noticing it. Neuroscientists refer to this as habituation. We adapt to stable conditions because constant awareness would overwhelm our mental resources. Think about the scent of your own home. Visitors notice it immediately. You don't. Not because it disappeared, because your brain decided it no longer required attention. Relationships often follow the same invisible rule. Gratitude slowly becomes assumption. Attention becomes routine. Appreciation becomes postponed. Then absence arrives like a spotlight. Suddenly everything becomes obvious. The jokes, the conversations, the encouragement, the reliability. Even the disagreements begin to look different when there is no opportunity to resolve them. Memory is selective. It doesn't preserve life exactly as it happened. It edits. It rearranges. It emphasizes. With enough time, the ordinary moments begin competing with the extraordinary ones. A simple laugh becomes as emotionally significant as a major milestone, because scarcity changes perceived value. Behavioral economists have demonstrated this principle repeatedly. Scarcity increases perceived importance. Things become more valuable when access becomes limited. That principle doesn't only apply to products. It applies to people. Not because human worth changes, because attention changes. The person who always seemed available now becomes psychologically scarce. Scarcity forces evaluation. Evaluation creates reflection. Reflection creates change. Notice something else. The people most affected by your absence are rarely the ones who admit it first. Pride has an interesting relationship with loss. The ego wants to appear unaffected even while the emotional system is working overtime, underneath the surface. That's why behavior often reveals more than words. People check old conversations. They revisit familiar places. They ask mutual friends indirect questions. They suddenly remember anniversaries they ignored before. Not because someone told them to, because the mind naturally searches for unfinished emotional experiences. Closure isn't something people simply decide to have. It's something the brain continually attempts to construct. Until it succeeds, attention keeps returning to the same unanswered questions. And that's where transformation quietly begins. Not through dramatic apologies, not through emotional declarations, but through repetition. Every day without the familiar pattern teaches the brain something new. Every missed expectation rewires a small piece of how reality is understood. Neuroscience often summarizes this process with a simple phrase: neurons that fire together wire together. The reverse is equally important. Patterns that stop repeating gradually weaken. Old expectations dissolve. New identities begin forming. This is why genuine change almost never feels dramatic while it's happening. It's microscopic. Day after day. Decision after decision. Thought after thought. Then one afternoon, someone catches themselves reacting differently than they would have 6 months earlier. They pause. They notice. And only then do they realize how much the silence has been teaching. The first instinct is always resistance. People tell themselves nothing has really changed. They convince themselves that this is temporary, that tomorrow will restore yesterday, that all they need is a little patience. The mind prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar uncertainty because at least familiar pain comes with a map. But reality doesn't negotiate with expectation. Every day that passes without the old pattern quietly rewrites the brain's predictions. What once felt impossible slowly becomes normal, and that's where the real transformation begins. Not in the moment someone leaves, but in the thousands of ordinary moments that follow. Morning routines feel different. Evening conversations disappear. The little habits that once happened automatically become noticeable only because those gone. It's strange how the smallest details often carry the greatest emotional weight. Rarely do people miss only the grand gestures. More often, they miss the tiny moments they barely acknowledged while they were happening. A familiar greeting, an inside joke, the certainty that someone would answer. Those moments seemed ordinary because they happened so often. Now they become landmarks in memory. This is one of the most fascinating characteristics of human perception. We rarely evaluate the importance of an experience while we're living it. We understand its value only after it becomes unavailable. Think about how often people say, "I didn't realize how much that meant until it was gone." That sentence appears in countless different situations because it reflects a universal truth about attention. The brain is designed to conserve effort. It stops actively appreciating what appears permanent. Stability becomes invisible. Reliability becomes expected. Then absence interrupts that illusion. Suddenly, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Not because the past changed, because perception changed. And perception shapes emotion more than reality itself. That's why two people can experience the exact same separation and emerge completely different. One becomes bitter. The other becomes wiser. One obsesses over blame. The other develops understanding. The event is identical. The interpretation creates the outcome. Researchers studying resilience have consistently found that meaning matters more than the event alone. The stories people tell themselves after hardship often determine whether that hardship becomes a prison or a turning point. Some people spend years asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Others begin asking, "What is this teaching me?" Those questions lead to completely different futures. The first keeps attention fixed on the past. The second opens the possibility of growth. Notice something else about absence. It removes distraction. When someone is constantly present, it's easy to avoid confronting yourself. Conversations fill the silence. Shared routines occupy the day. External interaction keeps internal questions at a distance. Then the silence arrives. Without realizing it, people begin hearing thoughts they had been avoiding for months, sometimes years. Questions become louder. What do I actually want? Who have I become? Why did I tolerate things I knew weren't healthy? What have I been pretending not to notice? Silence has a remarkable way of exposing truths that noise successfully concealed. Many people fear being alone because they mistake solitude for loneliness. They're not the same. Loneliness is the painful feeling of disconnection. Solitude is the opportunity to reconnect with yourself. At first, the difference is difficult to recognize. Both are quiet, both remove external stimulation, but one slowly drains you, while the other gradually restores clarity. The challenge is that clarity often arrives only after discomfort. Few people enjoy facing themselves without distraction. It's much easier to stay busy, much easier to scroll, much easier to fill every empty moment with noise. Yet growth has an unusual relationship with silence. Most breakthroughs happen after the mind finally stops running long enough to observe itself. That observation changes everything. Instead of reacting automatically, people begin noticing their own patterns. They recognize how often fear disguised itself as caution, how often pride disguised itself as confidence. How often avoidance disguised itself as patience. Awareness is uncomfortable because it removes excuses, but it also creates freedom. You cannot change a pattern you cannot see. Once a pattern becomes visible, every future decision carries a new level of responsibility. This is why genuine personal growth rarely feels exciting in the beginning. It feels inconvenient. It asks difficult questions. It dismantles comfortable stories. It forces honesty. And honesty has a way of disrupting identities that were built on illusion. There comes a point when the person left behind notices something unexpected. The emotional intensity begins fading. Not because the memories disappear, not because the past loses meaning, but because the nervous system cannot remain in a heightened emotional state forever. Human beings adapt. They always have. The remarkable thing is that adaptation doesn't erase love, appreciation, or grief. It simply changes their role. Instead of dominating every thought, they become part of a larger understanding of life. The memories stop feeling like open wounds. They become reference points, lessons, reminders, evidence of how much a person has evolved. Ironically, this is often the moment when others begin noticing the change. Not through dramatic announcements, not through carefully crafted speeches, through behavior. Confidence becomes quieter. Boundaries become clearer. Decisions become more intentional. Emotional reactions become less impulsive. There's a certain calm that develops in people who have learned to survive what they once believed would destroy them. It isn't arrogance. It's perspective. They know what uncertainty feels like. They know what rebuilding requires. They know they can endure more than they previously imagined. That kind of confidence cannot be borrowed. It cannot be taught in a weekend seminar. It cannot be manufactured through motivational slogans. It is earned through experience. Experience that nobody volunteers for. Experience that almost everyone eventually faces. And perhaps that's the greatest paradox of absence. The very event that appears to diminish someone's life often becomes the catalyst that expands it. Not immediately, not painlessly, but steadily. The person who once depended on constant reassurance learns self-trust. The person who avoided difficult conversations learns honesty. The person who feared change discovers resilience. None of these transformations happen because suffering is magical. They happen because suffering removes illusions that comfort often protects. When those illusions disappear, reality becomes impossible to ignore. And reality, while uncomfortable, is often the beginning of genuine freedom. Then something even more unexpected begins to happen. The people who believed your absence would be temporary slowly realize that time is no longer standing still for either of you. Life has an extraordinary way of moving forward without asking for permission. Birthdays arrive, seasons change, cities evolve, new routines quietly replace old ones. At first, these changes seem insignificant, but over months, and eventually years, they accumulate into something impossible to ignore. The version of you they remember gradually stops existing, not because you erased the past, because growth rarely asks whether anyone is ready for it. Most people carry an outdated image of others in their minds. They remember who someone was during the last chapter they shared together, and then unconsciously assume that person remained exactly the same after the story separated. Reality tells a different story. Every challenge leaves fingerprints. Every difficult decision reshapes priorities. Every disappointment teaches something. Every success changes confidence. No one stays emotionally frozen unless they choose to. Yet memory often freezes people in place. That's why reunions can feel so strange. People expect to meet the version they remember. Instead, they encounter someone shaped by experiences they never witnessed. That gap between expectation and reality creates one of the most powerful psychological moments a person can experience. Recognition mixed with surprise. Familiarity mixed with distance. They know your face, but they no longer know your mind. And that realization carries enormous emotional weight. It's difficult for the brain to reconcile two conflicting truths at once. This is the same person. This is no longer the same person. Both statements are true. Both exist simultaneously. Growth doesn't erase identity. It expands it. Imagine reading the first chapter of a novel, putting it down for years, and then opening directly to the final chapter. The main character still has the same name, the same history, the same memories, but everything else has changed. Perspective, confidence, values, priorities. The experiences between those chapters transform them. Human beings are no different. Your absence didn't simply remove you from someone else's daily life. It created space for both of your stories to continue independently. That independence changes everything, because people often confuse attachment with permanence. Attachment says, "This is how things will always be." Reality quietly replies, "Nothing remains exactly as it is." The people who expected you to wait forever eventually discover that waiting is not the summies. Turnerfullers to waitin, movement is. Adaptation is. Growth is. Even rivers that appear calm are constantly flowing. Stand beside one long enough, and you'll realize you're never looking at the exact same water twice. People work the same way. Every conversation changes them. Every book changes them. Every heartbreak changes them. Every victory changes them. Transformation isn't an event. It's a process happening every single day, whether anyone notices or not. Most of it occurs beneath awareness. Small adjustments, tiny shifts, invisible decisions, until eventually the accumulation becomes visible. Behavioral scientists sometimes describe this as the compound effect of repeated actions. One decision seems insignificant. One habit seems harmless. One conversation seems ordinary. But repeated hundreds of times, those moments reshape an entire personality. The same principle applies emotionally. One act of self-respect doesn't create confidence. Hundreds of acts do. One healthy boundary doesn't transform someone's identity. Living by those boundaries consistently does. One difficult conversation doesn't eliminate fear. Choosing honesty again and again slowly changes how fear operates. People searching for dramatic turning points often overlook the quiet revolutions happening beneath the surface. Those quiet revolutions matter far more, because they're sustainable. Anyone can feel inspired for one afternoon. Real change is measured on ordinary Tuesdays, on mornings when nobody is watching, on evenings when excuses would be easy. That's where identities are built. Not under spotlights, inside routines. This is why absence sometimes becomes the greatest teacher discipline ever has. Without constant external feedback, people are forced to answer a difficult question. Who am I when no one is validating me? It's surprisingly uncomfortable. Many identities are built almost entirely through reflection. Compliments become confidence. Attention becomes self-worth. Approval becomes direction. Remove those mirrors, and confusion often follows. For a while, people don't know who they are without someone else's reactions defining them. Then slowly, a quieter confidence begins to emerge. One that isn't dependent on applause. One that doesn't disappear when criticism arrives. One that remains steady because it was built internally instead of borrowed externally. That kind of confidence looks different. It doesn't compete. It doesn't constantly explain itself. It doesn't need every room to agree. It simply exists. Ironically, this is often when others become most aware of it. Confidence that isn't seeking attention naturally attracts attention. Calmness stands out in a world addicted to urgency. Presence becomes noticeable when it no longer demands recognition. People often mistake this for mystery. It isn't mystery. It's stability. There's less emotional noise, less chasing, less proving, less performing, and more intention. Think about someone who has truly mastered a skill. They rarely rush to convince everyone they're talented. Their work speaks first. Their consistency speaks louder. The same principle applies emotionally. People who have genuinely grown don't spend every conversation announcing it. Growth reveals itself naturally, in how they respond instead of react, in how they listen instead of interrupt, in how they choose peace over unnecessary conflict. These changes seem subtle from the outside, yet they're enormous internally. Because emotional maturity isn't measured by how loudly someone declares their wisdom. It's measured by how consistently they practice it when life becomes difficult again. And life always becomes difficult again. No amount of growth removes challenge. What growth changes is the response. The same setback that once shattered someone's confidence now becomes a problem to solve. The same criticism that once ruined an entire week becomes useful information. The same uncertainty that once created panic becomes an invitation to adapt. Experience doesn't eliminate emotion. It expands emotional capacity. That's a profound difference. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to move with wisdom despite fear. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's remaining grounded while conflict exists. Healing isn't forgetting the past. It's remembering it without becoming trapped inside it. Perhaps that's the lesson nobody expects absence to teach. The greatest transformation doesn't happen because someone finally returns. It happens because, somewhere along the way, a person discovers they no longer need life to return to what it was. They've built something new, something stronger, not perfect, but real. And reality, once embraced, has a remarkable way of making old illusions impossible to believe again. There is another layer to this that most people never notice, because it unfolds so gradually that it feels invisible while it's happening. The human mind has a habit of assigning emotional value based on repetition. Whatever appears consistently becomes part of the brain's internal model of reality. It no longer asks whether that pattern will continue. It simply assumes it will. That's why unexpected absence feels so disorienting. It doesn't just remove a person. It removes certainty. And certainty is something the brain craves more than happiness itself. People often say they want excitement, unpredictability, and constant adventure. Yet when uncertainty enters their emotional lives without invitation, they quickly discover how exhausting it can be. Questions begin multiplying. Should I reach out? Should I let go? Did I misunderstand everything? Were there signs I ignored? The search for answers becomes relentless, because unanswered questions consume attention. The brain keeps reopening the same file, hoping that this time it will discover information that wasn't there yesterday. But something fascinating happens after enough time passes. The questions themselves begin changing. Instead of asking, why did they leave? People start asking, why did I become so dependent on their presence? That shift changes everything. The first question looks outward. The second looks inward. One searches for someone else. The other discovers yourself. That is where real transformation begins. Growth is rarely found in the answers we expect. It's usually hidden inside the questions we avoided asking. Many people spend years believing they lost the most important person in their lives. Then they slowly realize they had also lost themselves long before anyone walked away. They had compromised pieces of their identity to maintain comfort, ignored instincts to preserve peace, silenced opinions to avoid rejection, accepted less than they deserved because uncertainty seemed more frightening than dissatisfaction. Absence shines a light on those compromises, not to punish, to reveal. Because what remains after everything unnecessary falls away is often much closer to who you truly are. Imagine an old building covered by layers of paint accumulated over decades. Each new layer hides the original structure a little more. Then one day, restoration begins. Removing those layers doesn't create the building. It reveals what was there all along. Personal growth often works exactly like that. People think they're becoming someone new. In many cases, theirs uncovering the version of themselves that existed before fear convinced them to shrink, before disappointment convinced them to settle, before rejection convinced them to doubt their own worth. The absence that once felt like destruction slowly begins resembling restoration, not because the experience was enjoyable, because it exposed everything that required rebuilding. This is one of the paradoxes of emotional resilience. The strongest foundations are often built after the old ones collapse. Not because collapse is desirable, because rebuilding demands intention. No one accidentally constructs a stronger life. They do it one deliberate choice at a time. One healthier boundary. One honest conversation. One difficult decision. One ordinary day repeated consistently. The people who eventually surprise everyone aren't usually the ones who changed overnight. They're the ones who quietly changed every single day. No dramatic announcement. No grand performance. No desperate attempt to convince others they had transformed. Just consistent action. Consistency is persuasive in a way words never will be. Anyone can promise change. Repeated behavior is proof. And proof has a unique effect on those who once underestimated you. At first they dismiss it. It's probably temporary. Then they question it. They seem different. Eventually they accept it. They're not the same person anymore. That realization can be unsettling, not because your growth threatens them directly, because it forces comparison. Whenever someone witnesses genuine transformation, they're reminded of the possibilities they've postponed within themselves. Sometimes that inspires admiration. Sometimes it creates discomfort. Sometimes both at once. Psychologists have long observed that people naturally compare themselves with those around them. It's almost automatic. When someone remains exactly as they were, comparison feels safe. When someone evolves beyond old expectations, comparison becomes more complicated. The comfortable story begins to crack. If they could change, what does that say about me? That question lingers. Not because anyone asked it aloud, because the mind asks it silently. This is why authentic growth often influences people without a single motivational speech. Behavior changes beliefs more effectively than arguments. Watching someone become calmer makes others question their own chaos. Watching someone develop discipline exposes the cost of excuses. Watching someone establish healthy boundaries reveals where others abandon their own. Example has always been stronger than explanation. Not because words lack power, because actions remove debate. They become undeniable evidence. There is another misconception about absence that deserves attention. People often assume that healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Memory and healing are entirely different processes. You can remember someone clearly without needing them to complete your life. You can appreciate what existed without becoming trapped inside it. You can honor the past while refusing to live there. Think about walking through a museum. You observe history. You learn from it. You respect it. But eventually you leave the exhibit and continue living in the present. Emotional maturity works in much the same way. The past becomes a place of understanding rather than permanent residence. That distinction changes how memories feel. Instead of reopening wounds, they become reminders of distance traveled, evidence of resilience, proof that survival became growth. Perhaps that's the quiet truth hidden beneath every meaningful absence. The greatest change isn't always visible to the people watching from the outside. It happens in the private moments, the moments when no one applauds, when no one notices, when no one is keeping score. It's choosing peace instead of replaying old arguments. It's choosing purpose instead of waiting for closure. It's choosing self-respect instead of chasing what has already moved on. Those decisions rarely feel dramatic, yet over time, they reshape an entire life. And one day, almost without realizing it, you wake up and discover something remarkable. The silence that once felt unbearable has become peaceful. The emptiness that once frightened you has become spacious. The absence that once seemed like the end has quietly become the place where a stronger, wiser, and more grounded version of you first began to emerge.